a faculty member here since 1972. I teach American history, history of American women, and a course in historic site interpretation. It is because of my interest in historic site interpretation that I became involved with Historic Columbia Foundation in 1974. I felt that now that I was living in the South, having moved here from Massachusetts, that the best way to learn about Southern history was to become involved with a historic house museum in Columbia. I attended docent training sessions at Historic Columbia Foundation that were then led by Dr. Roger Stroop, who is the director of the foundation. I learned a great deal about the families of the Hamptons and the Prestons and Woodrow Wilson when he lived here in Columbia, as well as about the Robert Mills house. I chose to become a docent in the Hampton-Preston mansion on alternate Friday afternoons, September through May, from 1974 through 1976. I also one year served on the Interpretations Committee of the Hampton-Preston mansion. I enjoyed those years there. I think this was a good time for the organization. Roger Stroop was a good director, and speaking as a docent, he built into the docent program what I would call rewards, which were field trips to various historic places. For example, we went to out of state to Monticello, also to Augusta, Georgia, to Savannah, Charleston, Winston-Salem for Old Salem, and I learned a great deal. I felt that relations were quite harmonious in the 1970s, and there was a great deal of enthusiasm among the docents for holding open house during Christmas, decorating the houses. Some docents got dressed up in costumes. I basically was in the basement of Hampton-Preston mansion providing cokes and cookies for the dressed up docents when they took their breaks. We also had a spring open house, and I worked with others in demonstrating herbs. I wore a colonial costume. After that point, though, by the late 1980s, Dr. Stroop left to work for the South Carolina State Museum Commission, which was planning a new museum that opened in the late 80s. Currently, he is director of the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. After Dr. Stroop left, it seemed to me that there were a succession of directors of the Historic Columbia Foundation because of a variety of problems that began to emerge. One of the problems was sort of an internal contest between staff members or directors who wanted to take the organization in a more professional direction, and board members who had played an important role in saving the organization, saving the buildings from destruction in the late 1960s, raising the money to buy them, and that they wanted to continue to shape the direction of the organization. This was very frustrating for a number of the directors. And so after a few years, they left. I would bring my students in historic site interpretation to visit, or field trip to visit Historic Columbia Foundation, and we would talk candidly with the directors and some of the problems that they faced. The idea is the students would gain insight into some of the problems that were involved in being a director of such a historic organization. So it was a learning experience, but I could very well, for the students, but I could very well see it was frustrating. What began to happen is a split between the Historic Columbia Foundation that had title to the collections as an accredited museum, and the Richland County Historic Preservation Commission that owned the buildings. And with such divided authority, it was almost impossible for staff members to function effectively. And I remember writing in June 1987 a letter to Mr. Robert D. Coble, a member of the County Council, Richland County Council. He is now Mayor of Columbia, urging him to support a merger of the Richland County Historic Preservation Commission into the Historic Columbia Foundation. It took years, really, for this particular division to be resolved. It hadn't really been resolved until the mid-1990s, with the result that there was considerable instability in the Historic Columbia Foundation and the management of the houses. It was hard to find good staff members. Funding declined. There were sometimes, it was difficult for the foundation even to get the funding to maintain the collections. Apparently, Historic Columbia Foundation almost lost museum accreditation a few years ago. In more recent years, the problem has been somewhat resolved in that the two organizations, the Richland County Historic Preservation Commission, Historic Columbia Foundation, have merged, but the Historic Columbia Foundation is the organization in charge of setting the policy. The problem still is, however, is to find a new director. There was a director there for many years, Ray Sigmund, whom I thought did a pretty good job. He had directed Historic Columbia Foundation. When the merger occurred, he had more responsibilities, and this became a very large job, and he tried to bring in new staff to help him, but it wasn't entirely smooth. So he has left, and the Historic Columbia Foundation is in the process of hiring a new director this year. They tried last year, and it did not result in a successful conclusion to the search. We can only hope that as time goes on, that with a new director and strong funding, which seems to be quite possible both from the county and the city as well as outside organizations, that Historic Columbia Foundation will have the bright future that many of us who have watched it for over a quarter of a century feel it richly deserves. I would like to make a few comments about why people become docents. When I was a docent in the 1970s, my purpose was to learn about the South and become involved in some way in the community. I did not expect to do it every single year. I have a great deal of respect for the women and some men who were docents there. Many of them did not have a full-time job, or most of them did not have a full-time job, and therefore they could devote their energies to doing this. A number of them were retired, some had been school teachers. I think they did a good job. One problem with some of the, shall I say, older docents is that once they got some ideas into their minds, it might be very, very hard for them to change them. And they also tended in some cases to form close-knit circles. And there was a time in the 1970s in which the docents at Woodrow Wilson's boyhood home were of this kind of persuasion, and they told some absolutely false stories about Woodrow Wilson. One of them told me he died of syphilis, which he did not. Where she got that, I do not know. Another one had a photograph that I think was relatively original, in which she had circled the head of somebody and identified who it was in the margin. Since then, of course, the Woodrow Wilson Boyhood Home has had a great deal of attention, and they have an excellent exhibit on the second floor connecting the home and Columbia to Woodrow Wilson's career, and it was the major scholar on it was John Shearer, who now works there as curator of collections. So you did have some of these docents who would tell stories that were not exactly true. There were others who were what we would call very object-oriented, that when they led a tour of a particular room, they would identify by pointing every single item. This was the egg cup used by the Hamptons and the Prestons. Somehow you lost the forest for the trees. One of the most difficult things is to train docents to a new level of interpretation. There's a tremendous tendency for them to revert back to what they know and are familiar with. For example, I had a graduate student named Marcia Synnott who developed a woman's history interpretation of the Hampton-Preston mansion. And there were exhibits on the women who had lived in the mansion, even the time when it was the college for women were there, and it was very good. The idea was to get, in part, the docents to start emphasizing the women of the Hampton-Preston mansion rather than the three Wade Hamptons. But after the exhibit was dismantled, Marcia Synnott moved to Arizona by way of position in Chicago. I heard that many of the traditional docents went back to the old interpretations of the three Wade Hamptons. I am optimistic, however, about the new interpretation of the Hampton-Preston mansion that will interpret a particular room for a particular time period. That will mean that a room will be given to the time not only of the women in the family who were important, Mary Canny Hampton, Caroline Hampton-Preston, and so forth, but also when the house was used as a women's college. So this is, I think, the challenge of all organizations, because Historic Columbia relies on volunteer docents. Another problem organizations like Historic Columbia Foundation face is that many of the women of a younger generation don't have the time to put into such volunteer activities. They have full-time jobs. They may even continue to work after retiring from one job, at least part-time. They have care and concern for their grandchildren. So it may mean that at some point Historic Columbia Foundation may have to look into paying their docents something in order to develop motivation for them to work. So it is a challenge that many of the smaller museums do face.